Now here's the shipping forecast issued by the Met Office at 0015, today Saturday the 29th of May. Fisher, German bite. Rain later, mainly good. Becoming
24 years in prison. You know, what do we do now?
The area forecasts for the next 24 hours. Humber, Thames, Dover, Wight, Portland. Fair then occasional
24 years is a lifetime. I mean, how do you expect Jamie's children to get their head around a sentence like that? The sentence their father was given was longer than the lives that they'd lived.
A group of fishermen from the Isle of Wight, all now serving long sentences for one of the largest, most audacious drug plots in British history. The case against them, 1/4 ton of cocaine, was hidden on a huge container ship on its way to Holland. The drugs were dumped in the English Channel for the men to pick up in a fishing boat in the middle of the night. They sailed back to these cliffs and tied the sacks to a buoy to collect later or for someone else to pick up.
Hello? Hello, darling, you right? Yes, good. Yeah, we're okay. We've, Maisie's just got in, she's not got
The men involved have left behind wives and girlfriends, sons and daughters.
I'll pass you over. Speak to you in a bit, love you.
Hello, Daddy.
Jonathan Beer, convicted of organising the plot, is serving 24 years in a high-security prison.
They literally came through the door in the morning, asked me and the children to stay in here, just said we need to speak to your husband. Took John into the front room, asked him a range of questions. When I asked him what was going on, he just said, we need your husband to answer some questions in connection with a serious crime. Yeah, okay, whatever. This is mad. Are we awake? What's going on here?
When you found out what he was being accused of and charged with,
yeah.
What was your reaction?
Oh, it's ridiculous. What? It's just a stupid mistake. And he'll be home, which they told Flynn, don't cry, Nipper. Don't cry, be brave, Daddy'll be home tonight. And I even told John when he emptied his pockets to keep £40 in his pocket so he could get himself home that night.
But he never came home?
Didn't come home, he hasn't been home since the 18th of January 2011.
The facts of this case are murky to say the least. Stories have changed, evidence has been damaged. The 5 men have always said they are innocent. Their new defence team is now planning a fresh appeal. We've spent 6 months looking in detail at the evidence, obtaining exclusive footage never shown in public before. A bank holiday weekend 6 years ago. In mid-afternoon, a fishing boat, the Galwad, left on what a crew still claim was a routine trip.
When he went out on the 29th, it was quite rough weather. Jamie always fished mid-channel. A lot of the smaller inshore boats couldn't get out that deep, so obviously it was a good area because it wasn't overfished.
Nikki Green is the sister of Jamie Green, 45 years old with 3 children and no serious criminal record. He was the man in charge, the skipper of the boat.
Why would he go out in conditions like that?
Jamie, the weather was forecast to blow until about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and then it would have dropped off. That time would have been his travelling time to where he would work. So the fact that it was particularly bad weather at that point wouldn't have bothered him too much because he would have been out on the spot when the weather improved and been able to get straight to work.
So it wasn't unusual then for him to go out in those kind of conditions?
No, not at all.
That night, a major drug search was taking place in the Channel. The full details of Operation Disorient have never been made public, but we do know it involved surveillance planes, a patrol ship, and police lookouts along the coast. Intelligence had come in that cocaine was being smuggled on huge container ships from South America. It appears this vessel, the MSC Orion, was one of a number being watched that night. At some point, both cargo ship and fishing boats came close together. The Galwad continued, sailing past Freshwater Bay. The next day, a member of the public spotted 11 waterproof sacks tangled around a buoy in the same bay, each packed with a pure form of cocaine. Today, the Galwad is rusting away in a boatyard in Cowes. The police said the drugs were picked up by this fishing boat and dropped off in the bay to be collected later.
What we're looking for on board today is just anything that might have been missed when the police searched the vessel.
For years, the lawyer Emily Bolton had been living in the US, working with inmates on death row.
I'm looking at documents and I'm also taking photographs of what remains of the electrical equipment on board.
Now she's set up the first charity of its kind in Britain, specialising in miscarriage of justice investigations.
I think the police really thought the drugs were down that hole there.
That is what?
That is the Vivia tank. If you'd like to just peer over the edge, you'll see that that is full of water, which is used to keep lobsters alive before they make their way to your plate. The fire brigade came in the middle of the night in Yarmouth Harbour, stuck pumps down there, pumped it all out. Someone was brave enough to climb down that ladder and then start looking around for signs of drugs being stored down there. And they found absolutely nothing.
But presumably if the drugs were stored in watertight bags, which in this case they were, it's not surprising they found no trace of the actual cocaine itself.
You say that the drugs were packed in watertight bags. Actually, they weren't, because several of the bags, when they opened them, they then ripped open the plastic containers and got into the cocaine. The cocaine was damp. You could expect on any vessel that had carried those bags some leakage, some sort of very, very weak cocaine soup. And that's why they went over the boat with a fine-tooth comb, in this case an itomizer, which is a device that detects traces of drugs. So it's not that they were just looking for a big pile of cocaine, they were looking for a trace. And so they used the itomizer to see if they could find that cocaine soup, and they didn't find any.
At the time the Galwad was in the channel, a series of calls were made to the satellite phone on the boat. The prosecution said these were evidence that someone on shore was coordinating the drugs drop. The defence said the timing was a coincidence and someone was checking on the health of one of the fishermen, a migrant from Eastern Europe. 38-year-old Daniel Payne was one of the men on board the fishing boat that night. He's now serving 18 years at HMP Coldingley in Surrey.
It's just not in his nature to do that sort of thing. He has no need to do that sort of thing. He was happy with his partner, he was happy doing his fishing, he had a job in the building industry and so on. And when that sort of tailed off a bit, he went odd jobs with the skipper of the boat. And that's what it was. That day was just one-off fishing trip, just to get some money.
And when you think the last time that he was in this position coming back through there would have been that night, I guess.
Yeah, the last time he came in, and
Daniel's family say he was visited by officers from the Serious Organised Crime Agency and offered a deal to stay out of prison.
2 officers came into the remand prison where he was and basically offered him immunity if he implicated the skipper of the boat in this case, if you like. And of course Daniel couldn't do that because there was nothing to implicate him with.
So he couldn't take up the offer?
No, he couldn't take up the offer because there's nothing to give.
I wanted to tell you where I'd got to with the CCRC summary, which is because...
Emily Bolton, meanwhile, has been trying to unpick the case against the men.
So that's kind of how that works.
At her charity's office in London, she has new evidence, which, she says, is their best hope of getting an appeal.
Well, this chart would have been really important to the jury in reaching a conviction, because what it purports to show here is the fishing vessel coming across the track of the container vessel as it moved up the English Channel. And that, the police insisted, showed that it was possible for drugs to have been transferred from the container vessel onto the fishing vessel.
The case against the fishing boat was based in large part on this navigational data. The container ship, the Oriane, was travelling from Brazil to the Netherlands. As she arrived in the English Channel, the fishing boat was just setting off from its home port of Yarmouth. It made its way round the Needles, heading south. We've plotted the exact course of both ships using navigational data from their onboard computers. By midnight, the fishing boat was in deep water in the middle of the channel. At the same time, the container ship, the Oriane, was moving at 19 knots towards the European mainland. Then, the key moment in the prosecution's case, The Oriane moves east and the fishing boat, the Galwad, south across her wake. There would have been a short window to hurl 11 sacks of cocaine off the side of the container ship and lift them on board the fishing boat.
They took photographs of the OLEX screen. They took screen.
Emily has now commissioned an expert review. She says it shows the prosecution got it wrong, leaving out key plot points and using damaged data.
The prosecution just drew a line between 2 points and asserted that that's where the container ship was. What we've got now is the GPS digital data from the fishing vessel and the underlying digital data for the container ship, and we've had an expert look at those and draw a far more precise map of what actually happened that night.
If true, it would mean the paths of the boats were never closer than 100 metres from each other.
The Oriane, the container ship, was actually heading further south than was presented to the jury at trial. That blows the prosecution case right out of the water.
100 metres isn't that far. Would it have not been possible for the drugs to be thrown off the side and then float 100 metres towards the fishing boat?
That's exactly the question we had, and we took that question to Plymouth Marine Lab, and they use complex modelling software to work out drift direction of any objects jettisoned into the sea. The drift direction would have taken any items thrown from the Oriane in a different direction.
As for the cargo boat, the Oriane, it sailed on to the Netherlands. A few days later, it did dock in the UK and was searched. No trace of drugs was found, and no one on the Oriane was ever arrested.
Picture of a bag recovered just off the point and Bolton police station.
The fishing boat, meanwhile, took 18 hours to sail back to the Isle of Wight. It was never stopped or boarded. It skirted round the south of the island, fishing near Freshwater Bay.
The area along the coast where he came back into would have been very slightly off of his normal route, not unusual. As I understand it, I think they decided to do some mackerel fishing on the way in.
By the time the Galwad returned to its home port, it was being watched. This surveillance footage shows it sailing into the harbour, and this, taken by officers on the ground, shows the men coming ashore. The skipper, Jamie Green, drives off in the white van. The men went their separate ways, but returned to Yarmouth that evening. It was at this point 3 were arrested, all for conspiracy to import cocaine.
I was working in the restaurant here where we are now. Somebody told me there was a bit of a kerfuffle on the quay involving Jamie, and then somebody came in and told me that he'd been arrested and taken to the mainland later that evening.
What was your reaction?
That it was a mistake, and the police would realise they'd made a mistake and everything would be okay.
The next morning, a member of the public spotted 11 sports bags tangled round a buoy in Freshwater Bay. He called the police.
This is number 2, and written on the bottom of the bag are the words Montana Wind.
Each sack was marked, each was packed with high-purity cocaine. It's here we get to a key piece of evidence against the 5 men, crucial to the convictions.
It's the only piece of direct evidence against the men, but the problem with it is it keeps changing.
As the fishing boat, the Galwad, was sailing back along the bay, 2 Hampshire police officers were stationed on these cliffs, keeping lookout as part of Operation Disorient. In the original police log, they recorded someone throwing 6 or 7 items overboard at intervals from the boat. The fishermen say they may have chucked away bags full of old bait around this time. The next day, after the drugs were found, those lookouts changed the official log, as they are allowed to do. In the new version, there were 10 to 12 items the size of a holdall, tied together in a line, followed by a red floating buoy.
But isn't it the case that if you're witnessing something like this, people might not get the details right every single time?
Well, these are officers who are trained to get the details right every single time. And also, we're not talking about small details. We're talking about big changes, about the descriptions of what they saw and also where they saw it from. If you look at the surveillance footage, the aerial surveillance, where they had a plane up here looking down on the drugs, the first thing you'll see is that there is a long, sinuous, windy white rope floating on the surface of the sea here, and you can see the sea is a kind of dark grey colour, and that rope really stands out. If these two Hampshire officers were up here on this cliff looking out there, the first thing they would have described was the rope, and they don't mention it.
So, what possible reason, if any, could the lookouts have to change what they saw? The new defence team can only speculate. One claim, the men were in custody at that point and more time was needed to question them.
They needed something to hold them while they continued with their investigation, because up until that point they'd found no evidence. And what happened after this embellishment was made was they continued to find no evidence, and that left them in a pickle. But I think that the reason they embellished that evidence was to extend the custody time limits and continue their investigation.
The two police lookouts later gave different details of what happened that day, but both were adamant they had seen 10 to 12 sacks thrown off the fishing boat along with a boy. They said that after they'd called in that first log entry, they'd seen extra bags thrown off the boat, so the second version was the full picture. The independent police watchdog looked into the case, and though it found inconsistencies in their evidence, they were not enough to show they'd fabricated those accounts. Complaints against them were dismissed. Hampshire police also say they have no ongoing complaints related to this investigation. At trial, the 5 men were convicted by majority verdict and sentenced to a total of 104 years in prison. The Serious Organised Crime Agency said the operation had stopped a huge amount of cocaine from reaching the streets of the UK.
But some people are just going to think it's too much of a coincidence that this fishing boat was in the wrong place at the wrong time, twice over.
Your question assumes two things, one of which is that there were drugs on the Ariane. That has never been proven. It appears to us that Operation Disorient really needed to get a result, and they started focusing on the fishing boat, and from then on interpreted all the evidence that came before them as pointing to guilt. And meanwhile they ignored or didn't even seek other evidence that points in the opposite direction.
The new evidence shown in this film has been passed to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, who will now decide if the 5 men can launch a fresh appeal. The National Crime Agency says it cannot comment while that investigation is ongoing.